Hi, Pastor Steve Pierce. Thanks so much for joining me for this morning devotion, Friday, March 27th. There's a lot going on, and for this devotion, I thought I'd do something a little bit different. I'd like to share some history, looking at COVID-19, comparing it with the influenza pandemic of 1918 through 1919, and then talking a little bit about Central Reformed Church and how we can continue to trust God through this difficult time. And then I'm going to close with a prayer. So let's see how this goes. I'm going to do some screen sharing with you. I'm going to bring up my slideshow here. There it is, COVID-19, Influenza Pandemic of 1918 through 1919 in Central Reformed Church. Pretty cool. All right, COVID-19, as of right now, on this Friday morning, there are 85,000 cases in the United States, and we have surpassed China and Italy with the number of cases. We may not have as many deaths. We have 1,200 deaths total. In the world, there are 530,000 cases with 24,000 deaths. So really sad. And we know these numbers are going to increase, and it's something we need to be praying about. We also can look for symptoms and take precautions. So if you have a fever, if you got cough, shortness of breath, these are things to look for. The prevention for COVID-19 is to wash our hands, avoid touching our eyes and nose and mouth, and then to cover our coughing, our sneezing with a tissue, throw that tissue in the trash, or cough into our elbow. Things like that will really help. Well, one of the questions I've been talking about is a COVID-19, a coronavirus pandemic, an unprecedented event. And there's a professor at Calvin University, William Caterberg, I think I'm saying his name right, who provides some helpful insights. In fact, Jeff Chu, our teacher in residence, forwarded an article to me, and I thought it was fascinating. In the last 100 years, we've seen several smaller pandemics, and of course, influenza pandemic of 1918-1919, which then was H1N1 virus. So there was a flu in 1957, 1968, SARS broke out, 2002, 2003, 2009, I think that was the swine flu, H1N1. And the steps we're taking today are actually similar to those taken in 1918. Acknowledge the threat, act quickly, enact social distancing policies or physical distancing policies, and then don't panic. Taking these steps will help reduce the spread of the virus and prevent hospitals from being overwhelmed. And if you want to see more, you can read Caterberg's article, The Flu Epidemic of 1918-1919 in Churchless Sundays. Go to origins.calvin.org. It's great. The influenza pandemic of 1918 through 1919 was first recorded, I believe, in Kansas, but the first cases of it hit New York City in August of 1918. And many cities throughout our country had slowed to a near halt. Schools had no choice but to close. Countless church services were disallowed. Even the federal government reduced its hours of productivity. Death's grip was beginning to tighten, and many of those who took ill in the morning were dead by night. It was quick. It was terrifying. The influenza pandemic of 1918 through 1919 was one of the world's worst plagues, when the virus killed at least 50 million people. Others say it may have killed up to 100 million people. Either way, the plague did not discriminate. More than 600,000 people in the United States died of what was then known as the Spanish influenza. At the time, there were 103 million people living in the United States. The flu seemed to be particularly lethal for otherwise healthy young adults, many of whom suffocated from the buildup of liquids on their lungs. In 1 year, the average life expectancy in the United States dropped by 12 years. Staggering. There were rules to prevent the disease's spread, including the following slogan: cover up each cough and sneeze. If you don't, you'll spread the disease. Masks were worn by the overly cautious when taking walks outside. For those infected, a fine could be issued of up to $50 if you were seen in public. That was a lot of money back then. Buckets of water with disinfectant were used on the sidewalks to wash away germs from people spitting on the street. Social distancing was a common practice. Wearing masks, barring home sales calls, calling off worship, closing schools, and secluding the sick were some of the many beneficial practices. However, in other areas, the death toll surged, and as a result, there were not enough coffins or graves to go around. It was just impossible for funeral homes to keep up with the demand. And this next slide here, this is a picture of the Rosewood Cemetery at the Community Reformed Church at Manhasset, New York. When I was the pastor there, the leadership decided that we would dedicate a section known as the Potter's Field. And there in the Potter's Field is a mass grave. How many? I'm not sure. That there are no consistory minutes that we could find, probably because people stayed home and there were no meetings. But we know that a lot of children died and families couldn't afford a proper burial. And so they'd open up the ground, and these people who deceased would be buried together. And one of the ways to mark that area, we had 2 stone lambs that were placed out in the grass to indicate that children were buried there. And so as the 100th anniversary approached, we had a service of worship in the morning, and then immediately following worship, we went to the cemetery to dedicate the cemetery, the Potter's Field. And we said that these loved ones would never be forgotten. They will always be remembered. May they rest in peace and rise in glory. In Grand Rapids, between September and December 1918, 2,500 of the 138,000 residents fell ill with either influenza or pneumonia, and about 295 people died. Some say Grand Rapids did not act fast enough, and many anticipated there would be more deaths, but there weren't. And so some thought that was providence. At the church, at Central, a lot was going on. First and Second Reformed churches merged in April 1918 to become Central. World War I ends later that fall, in November. There was a closing order issued in the fall of 1918. Mid-October through mid-November, the churches did not offer public worship. And I did find some bulletins to help me understand what was going on. And if you look at the bulletin where it says announcements and it's circled, don't worry, I didn't actually circle the bulletin, that's an electronic circle. It says the consistory had planned a congregational meeting which has been delayed by the closing order. So there are about 3 or 4 bulletins that are not available because there were no services. And then in August of 1919, I found this quote under announcements: "The more serious ill in our midst have not been as well for the last few days. Let us remember them all in our prayers." I have to believe that that's referencing those who are suffering from influenza or pneumonia. But interestingly enough, none of the bulletins ever mention Spanish influenza or influenza pandemic. You can't find it. And I'm not sure why that is. Maybe there are several reasons, but the one I'd like to think is that they didn't want to use that for fear that it would cause more anxiety in the system. I spoke to Dan Ballast, our church historian. He told me that in November through December 1919, Central's first pastor, Reverend John Dykstra, and family arrived to Grand Rapids and all contracted the flu. Pastor John and his son, Dean, his 2-year-old son, Dean, were placed on the critical care list and needed nursing care for several weeks. Pastor Dykstra had to postpone several meetings. It was a scary time for the church and for the family. And then in December 7, 1919, I found a request from consistory saying, when necessary to cough, and in winter this is sure to happen, please hold handkerchief to mouth so as not to disturb others. So there you go. Today, COVID-19 poses a serious threat, and the staff at church are doing their part to stay home and stay safe and to not spread any of this virus. And so here's a picture of our staff meeting on Zoom from March 15th. We had our live stream worship this past Sunday, March 22. Here are some families watching as the Pierce children and the Whitmer family. And I saw one church had put on their church sign, a clean hands and a pure heart, Psalm 24:4. We may limit contact, but not care for one another. And for now, our church building is closed until further notice. And then something Jeff Chu said during the announcements on Sunday that really resonated with me. He said, I have the quote here, we do this not out of fear of law, but out of love for neighbor. This is one of the ways we can keep one another safe at this time. And while the church building is closed, the church never closes. You are the church. We are the church. We will keep gathering creatively online whenever possible, and we will keep being the church, shining God's light and love into a world that so desperately needs it. I thought that was beautifully said, and I was grateful that Jeff offered those words on Sunday. Our church has weathered many storms, should be storms, since 1840. And this is one of those uncertain times, but we know the one in whom we can be certain. So let's renew our hope in God, remain faithful to our church, and grow in our love for one another. We can make phone calls, we can write notes, we can send emails, we can write texts. This is a time for us to stay in touch with people and let them know that we're praying for them. As I was thinking about this devotion, my mind kept racing back to Isaac Watts, who wrote the hymn, Our God, Our Help in Ages Past. And he based it on Psalm 90. Lord, you have been our dwelling place in all generations. Before the mountains were brought forth, or ever you had formed the earth and the world, from everlasting to everlasting, you are God. May we never forget that. And so here are some lines from the hymn. I want to read 1, 2, and 6. O God, our help in ages past, our hope for years to come, our shelter from the stormy blast, and our eternal home. Under the shadow of thy throne, still may we dwell secure. Sufficient is thine arm alone, and our defense is sure. And verse 6, O God, our help in ages past, our hope for years to come, be thou our guide, while life shall last, in our eternal home. In our closing prayer, most merciful and loving God, we come to you in our weakness. We come to you in our fear. We come to you with trust, for you alone are our hope. We place before you the disease present in our world, and we turn to you in our time of need. Bring wisdom to doctors, understanding to scientists. Endow all caregivers with your compassion and generosity, and bring your healing to those who are ill. Protect those who are most at risk. Give comfort to those who have lost a loved one. Welcome those who have died into your eternal home. Stabilize our communities. Unite us in our compassion. Remove all fear from our hearts. Fill us with confidence in your care. Bless and protect the members of our church, the friends of our church, as well as all those in faith communities in this city and in Michigan, in our country, and around the world. Together, may we be the hands and feet of Jesus to those in need. For we ask this in your name. Amen. Well, thank you for joining me for this devotion. I had to do it really early before the kids got up, so it's nice and quiet. But please know that I'm praying for you. Stay safe out there, and God be with each and every one of you. Take care. Bye-bye.